Get started here, we're going to be talking about creating splines inside of Cinema 4D. So there's a number of different ways of doing it, and there are presets that will sort of create shapes for you automatically that are splines. One of these we've already used, and that's called the text tool. So hopefully everyone remembers that from before, because that was using splines, and we were able to build text using that, even though there is another way of building text inside of Cinema 4D. That is one way that has been around for a while. But what I have on this page here are the letters that I use for tracing the ComD logos. So if you do want to follow along with this part, you have access to download these. Of course, when you do this for your final assignment, you can totally use your own drawings or designs, and if you have your own lines already ready that you want to use, that's totally cool as well. You can try to follow along as best you can. And let me put this in the chat here just in case everyone isn't on the board here. All right, so that should give you access to the Dropbox folder with these images, because that is what I'm going to be using now in a second here. Let me bring it up on my computer. Okay, so here, this is how we're gonna do this. Make sure I'm in the right lesson. There we go. Okay, awesome. So the Dropbox folder will have an alpha version, which means that my image will be on a transparent surface, or it has them on not alpha. Now, depending on how you want to, or how you're comfortable, doing your designs, you don't actually have to have it on alpha. Sometimes that helps since you want to see through your object into other things behind it. But that's totally up to you and how you want to export it from your application if you choose this method of creating your text, because this is just one way of doing it. So let's get started here. So let me switch to Cinema 4D and we can get started. All right, so first things first, where are the spline tools? So if you remember from before, the spline tools are up here, and let me make sure my mouse halo is on so that it's a little bit easier to follow my mouse, hopefully. Okay, there we go. So if you're looking to access the spline tools inside of Cinema 4D, you can come right up here to the top next to our cube icon and click and hold on that, and that will give you access to all the spline tools. And if you remember before, that's where the text was. And then if you can't get to that menu up there, if you go to create spline, you can find all of our spline tools here. Now specifically, we're going to be working with the pen tool. So for that one, all you actually have to do is just click this, and that'll actually get you straight into the spline tool. Yes, go ahead. Double checking. Yes, it is. Thank you for reminding me. So right up at the top here, you can just click this, and this will give you access to the spline tools. So automatically, once you click this, you'll notice that your attribute menu changes, and usually by default, what comes up here is the Bezier spline, and this is going to allow us to draw a path inside of our viewport. Now you can do this in our current viewport right now, which if you started like me from a new scene file, is the default camera, and this means that we're in a 3D perspective. Now, I will say that working with splines, since splines generally work on sort of a 2D sort of operation, it's a lot easier to create splines inside of 3D from one of the orthographic, which also just means flat perspectives inside of Cinema 4D. So if you remember before, you can middle mouse click, and that'll bring up your 4 view layout. And if you don't have the middle mouse ability on your mouse or your trackpad, you can come up here to the top right and you can click the sort of same viewport icon that'll give you into the split mode. And then you can click into another view that you want to use, or just click the 4 points, the top right icon, in order to activate that viewport. Because what I'm going to suggest is when you use the pen tool, if your object is on a flat plane or you're starting from just a flat sketch, it's a lot easier to start from either the right or the front view and build your lines that way. Yep, I am recording. Thank you for asking. It definitely helps a lot to have a flat way of working with it, because I don't know about you, but drawing in 3D isn't something that I'm particularly familiar with. I've gotten used to it over the years, but it's still not something that I would recommend to start off doing. But before we get too far into using the pen tool, what I would like to show you is how to bring in your image or images that you have on your computer that you wish to trace. So there are a number of different ways that you can go about doing this. Typically, I use the shortcut method for this, but I will show you the way to actually get to this directly. And let me go into my view settings. Yes, okay, so the way that you can get into this mode inside of Cinema 4D, and let me set everything back to the way it was when I started my scene here, just so that you can see from the beginning. So the way that you can add an image for reference into your scene is by first making sure that you're in the viewport that is an orthographic view, meaning that it has to be one of our flat views, because you can't actually add a background image using this method in our perspective view. We need to be in one of our orthographic or flat views. So I'm middle mouse clicking on my scene, or I can come up to my icon at the top right of my viewport. And for making it easy, I'm just going to come into my front view here by middle mouse clicking into it, or clicking the icons at the top right of this mini viewport now in order to maximize it. Once I am in this view here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my attributes manager, and I'm actually going to click on mode. And once I click on this, this is going to give me a number of different selections that I can choose in order to modify what comes up in my attributes here. And the one that I'm going to go to, or at least the one that always stands out to me to jump to first, is view settings. And this just gives me all of my viewport settings that I might need. So you can see that there are a number of different tabs, which is what we're going to go into next, but by default, this is just the viewport settings for whatever view you're currently in. And this goes with any view that you're in. So if you're in your perspective view, it goes for your perspective. If you go for your front, it goes for your front. If you go for your top, it goes for your top. But currently, I am in my front perspective, which you can see at the top left here is indicated with this text over here. Hopefully that is fairly obvious there. So now that I'm in my viewport settings, which I got to by going to mode, view settings, and now I want to go to the option over here that says back. And this is going to give me the ability to add in any image that I have on my system in order to be viewable inside of Cinema 4D's scene space right here. So as I look down here in my options, everything is pretty much grayed out except for the ellipses over here. So over here, and I'll zoom in just to make sure that it's obvious, is where I need to click in order to add an image into my scene. And that's going to bring up a menu. And then from there, I need to navigate to wherever I have on my computer the images that I want to use for reference inside of Cinema 4D. For the sake of explaining a bit more thoroughly, I'm going to add the alpha one, but you don't have to. It's totally up to you. And I'm just going to add in my first letter here. Now, I have these all set as a square size. It doesn't really matter the size as long as it's consistent with what you need for your workflow, especially since we're going to be working in 3D and we can change the whole size of our scene anyway. So I'm going to add the first one. And because I added in the alpha one, you can see that right now it doesn't look like it's working. And that's because I didn't actually turn on the ability for Cinema 4D to recognize that I'm using alpha on my image. If you add the image that isn't alpha, it's probably going to work perfectly fine and you won't even notice this issue. But if you do add the one that has alpha, you will come across this issue. And all it means is that I have to come down here to my alpha mode and turn this on to normal. And once I do that, now you can see in my scene, I have my image as it was originally intended, and I can zoom in. Right now I'm using the 2 key to zoom in, and I can position this however I need it to be. Now there's nothing in my scene. You'll notice that there's nothing in my object manager. If I switch back to my perspective view, I can't see this image because it's only in my front viewport. Now we're using this as a method of showing everyone how to do type inside of Cinema 4D, but for those of you who are interested in doing more character modeling or prop modeling, this is another common way that people will bring in their images in order to model their characters in 3D space. And when you do this using characters, usually you will bring in the image for the front and the right perspective in order to get, a good idea of how you're actually going to be modeling your character in 3D space. Sometimes some people do a top view as well, but that might be a little bit more overwhelming, but whatever amount you need for you to get a perspective on how to design your object is totally up to you. But yeah, so mini recap. In order to get this image in, I went to mode, view settings, and then I navigated to the back selection, and I went to the ellipses in the image slot, and I chose an image on my computer with either alpha or no alpha. And then I turned on alpha mode in order to make sure that I had transparency enabled, because otherwise it looks wonky in my scene. There are some other settings here. You can see that you can adjust the size, you can just offset, you can even rotate this in your viewport as well if you needed to rotate it for whatever reason. You can also adjust the transparency. I know sometimes some people have expressed that, once you start modeling, this gets in the way and you can't see what you're trying to move around. So keep in mind you can lower the opacity if it is getting in the way of what you're trying to do. So now that we've gotten this whole bit on how to get our image inside of Cinema 4D, we're going to start tracing this. And we're going to be using the pen tool or spline drawing tool. And right now, the type that is set on is Bezier. So you can see if I click this drop down here and I'll zoom into this, there are a number of different options here, and Bezier is sort of the traditional way of drawing spline points along a path. It's not the only way, and some of these other ways you might actually find easier to use. Cubic and B-spline specifically, or even Akima, are a lot more automatic in their ways of adding splines, but Bezier is sort of like the traditional way that you'll see in pretty much a lot of different design applications, not just 3D. So the way that this spline tool works on the Bezier selection is, in my viewport, I can come to any point that I want to start from, and based off of your design, one point might be easier to start from than others. So I'll definitely leave it up to you to determine what's the easiest point to start from. I usually like starting from what's at least the most flat surface, and in theory, even though my whole side is a rounded edge. But so I'm going to start by using the left mouse button and just clicking one point on my scene. And once I do that, you'll see that automatically it's creating a point in 3D space. And you can see on the right over here in the objects manager, it created a spline object, meaning that I'm starting to create splines inside of my scene. And using this method, I can continually add points in order to create the shape of my object. So I can come up to another point along the curve of my drawing here, left click and hold, and before I release, I actually can drag out what's called a Bezier handle, and this actually allows me to control the curvature of the spline that I'm creating. And using this method, I can continually create a shape around the path that I brought in as an image. And you can still move around your scene using the 1, 2, and 3 keys. There's nothing that's stopping you to continue to make our shape around my drawing that I have here, or your own drawing if you've already created your own drawing. Now this method that we're using right now obviously works more for if you have sort of a unique type of text, one that isn't, straight sort of font that you already have on your system. So if you're already just using, say, like an Arial type of text inside of Cinema 4D, this method might not be what you want to go in terms of being efficient with your time. I'm always a proponent of using your time in the most, valuable way that you can, especially since I'm generally more focused on production in terms of my normal workflow and what I usually do for a living. So that's just something that I focus on particularly. But, if you're sort of in the mode or in the mood for drawing spline points, you totally can zone out in doing this. Keep in mind that while I'm doing this, you might have seen that I have messed up a couple of times. Control Z or undo is your friend. So don't be afraid to use it if that does sort of happen. And you can notice that at the end there, I made sure to connect it to the original start point of my spline. So now if I middle button click, or I can come up to the right and click this in order to change my viewport. If I look in my perspective view, I can see that now I have my spline points inside of 3D. And what I can do now, if you remember from before, I can actually extrude this and make it a 3D object. So if you have forgotten, the way that you can bring up your extrude object is coming up to our top menu here and hovering over this icon at the top, and you can just click it. You don't actually have to hold and click it, and that'll add it into our scene. And now if I drag my spline object below my extrude, now I have 3D geometry of my text that I just created inside of Cinema 4D. And if I were to hit Control R, I can render this, and now I have my text that I can render to the viewport, and I can save this as a JPEG, and this can be awesome. So we got a question here about asking if extrudes only work with splines. No, extrudes actually work with other items, although primarily they're used for extruding splines, but there are some other creative uses, I would say, for using extrude or other types of extrude inside of Cinema 4D. But generally, the extrude object is used with splines for the most part. There are other ways of creating splines that are pretty cool. So it's not just sort of your boring splines. You can actually create animated splines inside of Cinema 4D. So you can do a lot of stuff with that. But no, extrudes work with a number of different things, but yeah, primarily they're used with splines. That is a good question to ask, especially since we're covering a lot of that right now. So again, if I go back into my view here, now something to keep in mind is that using the pen tool, once you've already created an object, if you create another one, it's actually going to create a new spline object inside of your scene, which, depending on what you're doing, may be something you want, maybe something that you don't want. But what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you another spline type, and then I'm going to show you one way to connect multiple splines together, or maybe two different ways, just to sort of round it off here. But what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to, on the left side here, I'm going to make sure I'm in the model mode first, just so that I can make a point to mention this to everyone, because when we are in our spline tool, it does set us into our points mode. So over here, if you didn't notice, when I started to create splines, it actually switches us into our point mode. And then when I was actually clicked out of this, depending on what I'm doing, it'll actually reset us automatically back into our model mode here. It doesn't always do that, but sometimes it does actually do that. But what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to come up here, I'm going to make a new spline, click the spline pen tool, and instead of using Bezier, I'm going to use cubic. And you'll notice that when I use the cubic, I actually don't get my Bezier handles that I had before. It sort of does its own sort of interpolation of the averages of the points that I'm creating here. So I actually don't have sort of as fine point control as I had before, but it does allow me to create my shape a little bit quicker if I know what I'm trying to do here. And I'm gonna zoom in here to create my last point. So just like that, using the cubic mode of the spline tool, I was able to create the shape a little bit faster than I was before, but maybe with a little bit less accuracy. So play around with the different types here, and you can see which ones work better for you in the way that you're trying to create your shape. Now I'm going to switch back to my model mode up here at the top left, and I'm going to come into my perspective view here just so that I can show everyone this. And I'll zoom in here because I know that seeing these splines via the screencast here can be a little bit hard to see. So again, if anyone has hard time seeing stuff, please just let me know so I can at least attempt to make it a little bit better for you. But what you would think by having this set up here is that I can just add the spline below my extrude object and it should extrude it perfectly. And let's see if that happens. So let's add our spline 2 here into my extrude object, and let's turn things on. And that doesn't look quite right to me. So something's happened here, and the reason why this is happening is because we have multiple splines inside of our extrude object, and the extrude object isn't quite smart enough yet to know what we want to do. There's a couple different ways that you can fix this. The easiest way to fix this is once you have your extrude object selected, you can come down to our object properties. And if you recall from before, there's the offset, which controls our depth. There's subdivision and isoprimes, which controls like the accuracy. Right now we're on auto direction, but you can tell this to go a different direction if it doesn't figure it out automatically for you. But the button that we want to hit is the hierarchical button all the way down here at the bottom of our option list here. So down here is hierarchical, and if we click this, you'll see that it sort of is able to figure out what we want to do. Not quite. Depending on your layer orders or your spline objects in your order, this might actually be a really good fix for what you're doing. You can see that in this case, it didn't actually work, but that's usually your first step in trying to remedy this option, because at least now we have this looking at least back to the way that we had it before. So it's reading through all the different spline objects. So depending on your setup, this might actually be a perfect fix for what you have set up, but sometimes it's not, which is what it looks like now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually show you how to connect splines together. So I'm going to uncheck my extrude object just so that this is not in our way right now. And I'm going to hold the shift key and select both of my spline objects together. So holding the shift key on my keyboard, which you might need to translate that if you're on a Mac computer, but you just want to make sure that both of these are selected. And you can drag select in the object viewport over here. If you're on the rectangle selection tool, let me delete this extra spline I created. You might actually be able to select both of these. Sometimes that doesn't work because I do have an extrude object in here and that's not hidden. So dragging in the viewport didn't work, but dragging over here in the object manager does actually work. And now that I have both of these objects selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click in my scene. Well, no, in the scene, oh, actually the scene does work. Okay, they updated that. Nice. So I can actually right click in my scene, or I can right click on the object manager, and that's going to give me a lot more items. So I think I'll do it in my scene just to make this a little less intimidating here. I'm going to right click, and in here there's a number of different options that you have. Of course, the top one is undo. Undo is always handy to know. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to come down here to the menu option that says connect objects, or I could go to connect objects and delete. And both of these do similar things. Obviously the difference being that one of these deletes and the other one keeps a backup. Depending on your level of paranoia, it might be good to just connect so that you can always keep a backup. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to connect and delete. And you can see that this brought my 2 items down to 1. So now I'm going to turn back on my extrude object, and I can see that now my hole cutout in the middle has been remedied. So now I have a cutout in the middle as it should have been, and the cutout from the other side is also there as well. And just for the sake of checking, if we can actually uncheck hierarchical, and you can see that this actually works completely fine. So just to recap, I'm going to undo a couple steps here. And I think also what I'm going to do is I'm going to save my scene as well, because it's always good to save your scene files. So I'm going to come back from the beginning here, and I'm going to show you the other way of doing this. So just to recap, I made sure to select both of my spline objects, and I can do that by holding shift and selecting both of them, or drag selecting in the viewport. Right click in either the object manager or in the viewport itself, and let's see. Oh, you can also come up to the top here and go to object and actually do it that way as well. And this time I'm going to select connect objects. So now you can see that it made a new spline entirely for me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off both of my old ones and then turn on my extrude object, and you can see that here it did the same thing as I did before, or as I had before, where now my object is one full piece. So you can imagine as you create your type, if you do for whatever reason want separate items, maybe want to eventually animate things independently of each other or do something more unique, keeping them separate to start off might actually be a good way to go about it, and then connecting it later on. Or you just might, misclick while you're doing something and you don't want to have to like restart all over, or use your undo like 100 times. There is a limit of undos in Cinema 4D, but I forget what it is, but there is a limit, so you can't always undo, so just keep that in mind. But yeah, so again, while we've been going through this, if anyone has any questions on this, please feel free to ask them. I think what I'm going to do, let's see if I can show you one more, and then I'm going to give everyone a break and to let them do this on their own. I wanted to show the connect object. Sure, I can do that. So yeah, so Another way that you can connect items inside of Cinema 4D is using what's called the connect object. So this is also in our this menu over here in our sort of next, it's right next to our pen tool. And then in here, there's actually a bunch of different tools, but the one that we're going to be focusing on right now is our connect object. And this is just one that I want to show just because it comes in really handy in terms of what it says, connecting items together. So right now I have my two splines, but let's say, for example, I didn't want to connect them and delete them, or I didn't want to connect and have a backup. I just wanted to keep these as is and just have them sort of, automatically sort of connect without having to do any sort of extra major steps that might, hurt me in the long run when I need to undo something. I would come up here, click and hold on this, and if I need to find this in the menus, this is in our create generate menu. So down here underneath bool is the connect object. So I can add this into my scene, and then instead of having these splines directly underneath the extrude, I'm going to shift select both of these and drag these under the connect object. And then I'm going to drag my connect object underneath my extrude. And then I'm going to turn on my extrude object, and we can see that now is as I also intended it, where the hole is cut out in the middle of the O here, as well as my original cutout for my original spline. So similar to the connect and delete or connect object that we got from the right click menu, this does the same thing. So I'm just showing you a bunch of different ways. Some of these you might remember, some of these you might completely forget. I know I do sometimes, but just so you're aware of, other options in terms of how to bring items together. There's even more ways than this that you can do, but I don't want to overwhelm anyone yet with all the different ways. There's definitely, I would say explore these different options. You might notice that there's, oh yeah, no problem. There's other ways that you can explore in here that you might want to check out. But yeah, so in terms of making a 3D object, the main thing that have to make sure that's in your scene is the extrude object. And depending on how you connect your splines, as long as this is in your scene and your splines are below it in the hierarchy, you will start to see some renderable geometry in your scene. Because if any of you have already tried to just render your splines, you'll notice that that doesn't actually render anything in your scene. So keep that in mind if you're trying to render your splines and you don't see anything, because I've done that before, especially when I first started. You won't see anything by default. There are some ways to render splines, but that's not really where we're at right now. That's more along the lines of using hair and stuff like that inside of Cinema 4D, which if anyone's interested in that, just let me know. Definitely something that we can explore later on if you're interested in making some furry creatures. Oh, no, so yeah, so Keon, so yeah, so that's a good question there. So yeah, I have been showing you how to use the spline or use the pen tool in sort of the orthographic view, but you can use it in the 3D view. So for example, I already have my splines here created, and if I were to switch into my point tool, our point mode here, and I go into my main object that I have in here, and if I were to, I'll go into the live selection tool, if I were to click any of these points, there's nothing that actually stops me from moving these in 3D space. So I can actually make 3D splines. And depending on what you're doing, this might actually create an interesting effect. Now, you'll notice that when I do extrude this, it does create some interesting shapes, which you may or may not like, depending on what you're doing. So sometimes that might not give you the desired results, but you can use it in 3D space. But I would say, for the sake of easiness, it's definitely easier to use it in the orthographic view. If I were to say, come over here, select my pen tool, and draw a G, sort of ish. So that looks okay, and because I was somewhat diligent in how I made it, it almost was on a perfect plane, but you can see that here, this is definitely on a slant, and some of these points are in almost sort of off axis, so I definitely wouldn't recommend creating in 3D, because if I were to try to extrude this, for the most part, it actually figured it out. So the only problem is that, of course, the whole letter or whole shape is on an angle here, so that might not be particularly conducive to what you want to do, but it is a possibility. So you can do it in perspective, but I definitely would say it's easier in orthographic view. But no, it's all up to you in the end in terms of what works for your workflow. Maybe you're trying to design something in Spline in 3D, then it might actually make sense to do it in 3D space. Or it might be, say you're trying to make a rope. That's something that I've done a whole bunch of times, where you're trying to make a rope for, say, like a wall outlet or something like that for cords or whatever. You can actually use splines to create that shape, and that would be something that, you know, you probably would do in 3D space. So it all depends on the sort of situation and the use case for what you're trying to do. But thank you for that question. That is a really good thing to keep in mind. Yeah, so if you already have a spline and you wish to adjust it after the fact, what you need to do is you actually need to go into the points mode of Cinema 4D. And once we get into doing more 3D geometry and modeling work, you'll become more comfortable with this. But making sure that you have your spline selected, you can go over to the left side of Cinema 4D, and here you have different modeling modes, which we haven't done a lot of modeling modes, so we haven't really got into this yet. But the first one here that I have highlighted is actually the points mode. So if I click this, it brings me into points mode, and now I can actually select the points that I previously created and move and adjust these based off of whatever I have set up from before. You can actually even delete the points if you don't like them as well. You can even add more points after the fact. So yeah, you definitely can modify them after the fact. So if it's not perfect on the first go, it's not the end of the world, because I know I definitely don't do it perfect on the first go. So yeah, so that's sort of the main crux of using, the pen tool inside of Cinema 4D. So spline pen, or the pen tool, and in the beginning part we use the Bezier option, which is a way of creating curves around a curved shape using handles in order to create them, and it's using a lot of math and geometry in order to create those shapes. But that's sort of the main crux of it, and there are other options here that you can sort of mess with. I'm just sort of giving you sort of the intro or the cursory view of how to use the spline tool, because I do want you to actually get experience actually using it, or just drawing some shapes. It doesn't have to be my shape. It can be your own sort of shape, or it can be a unique shape. Because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give everyone a bit of time to take a break and to create the first letters of a character of your sort of chosen name. It could be any sort of letters, or any sort of shape-ish type of thing using the spline pen tool. You can use my image if you want to use that as a reference, or if you've already have your own image, that's totally fine to use as well. I'm going to give everyone at least 15-20 minutes to start here, just so that you have some time to get used to using the pen tool a bit. Just take your time, create a letter. I'm only asking for one letter, so you don't have to create the whole word or anything like that. I don't want anyone to sort of overwhelm themselves with this. You'll have plenty of time over the week to do this for your assignment if you choose this method. Again, this is just one method for this. And then I'm just going to ask you to submit this to the in-class Dropbox. So I will